Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Gallagher, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean here in SIS. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, Quo Vadis, Transatlantic Relations. This is the first event of a four-part workshop on the future of the transatlantic order, jointly organized by American University and AU-Leuven. We're very excited by the growing partnership between our two institutions and the opportunities that lie ahead, including a joint master's course in the spring 2022, which will bring together AU and Leuven students to discuss the future of transatlantic relations. Before we get started, I'd like to review a couple of housekeeping measures. This virtual event will last about an hour. If you would like to submit a question to our panelists, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window at any time during the event. Answers to questions will not be typed in the Q&A function, but the closed captions will include all responses. We also ask that no one record this event. We will be automatically recording the webinar to the SIS YouTube channel, and it will be available a few minutes after it's over. Now let me introduce our panelists. Jim Goldgeier is the former SIS Dean and a current professor. He will moderate today's panel. Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovic was the fourth president of the Republic of Croatia between 2015 and 2020, and the first female to be elected to the office. Alexandra Brzozowski is a Brussels-based journalist specializing in EU affairs, foreign and defense policy for EURACTIV, and the author of the Global Europe Brief. Heath is the author of Global Translations, Politico's global newsletter and podcast, and previously author of Politico's UN Playbook, Brussels Playbook, and the Davos Playbook. Welcome all of you to SIS, and I will now pass it off to Professor Goldgeier.
Great, thanks so much, and great to be with such a distinguished group, and it's great to learn about the joint master's class next spring. I'm excited to hear about bringing together the students from AU and Leuven. I wanted to start with asking each panelist to reflect on sort of the path we've been on in recent years, and particularly we've seen quite a difference in rhetoric between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on Europe. In the Trump years, very traumatic for a lot of allies, with the Trump emphasis on insufficient defense spending and his labeling of the European Union as a foe. And President Biden came in with a desire to essentially reset relations with allies and talking about the importance of America's alliances in this global battle between democracies and authoritarian states. And so I just wanted to ask each of the panelists to start by reflecting on how much of what's we've seen going from one administration to the other in the United States is just a change in rhetoric, or are we already seeing differences with respect to policies as we've gone from a Trump administration to a Biden administration? Kolinda, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jim, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So as far as I'm concerned, I've been able actually to witness personally many of the events of the past years as former president of Croatia during the Trump administration, but also earlier during my time at NATO as Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, as Croatia's ambassador to the US, etc. So yes, the last 4 or 5 years have been marked by increased tensions, and we've witnessed moments when we thought that we are close to the breaking up of the alliance. However, of course, we have witnessed an asymmetry in contribution and an asymmetry in expectations for years and years. And one of the aspects that I need to underline is that throughout those years, it was up to the European Union to really step up to the plate and live up to the commitments that had been made with respect to defense spending, the 2% of the GDP plus or 20% of that for spending in technology. And most of the European countries were not delivering. So one of the elements that bothered President Trump at the time was the fact that He had to go back home and explain why Europe was not spending enough on defense, whereas on the other hand, talking about other issues and projects such as Nord Stream 2. So there were a number of issues that were on the agenda between the two sides of the Atlantic that compounded the external situation that was becoming increasingly complicated in geopolitical terms, with territorial threats re-emerging, but also with the emergence of the new threats that were compounded by the new technologies, both connective and disruptive. The fact that asymmetry of expectations actually started earlier, even with the Obama administration, with the pivot to Asia, when there was fear in Europe of the US abandoning Europe and pulling out strategically. So Europe has always expected of the United States global leadership, but also security guarantees. Now, throughout the years of the Trump administration, the corrosive effect that it had within the alliance, the disagreements on multilateralism in general, on the perception of the transatlantic alliance and expectations from the alliance, the disagreements on trade, on energy, Nord Stream 2, as I mentioned, but also JCPOA and climate, were distancing the two sides of the Atlantic. And one of the results was that the European Union was becoming more independent and started to think more strategically. So we've seen the rise of the JCPOA, the new 2016 EU global strategy, a strategic autonomy, and even we see some discussions about European autonomous forces. However, as we look into the future, I must say that the expectations on our side, on the European side of the Atlantic, of the Biden administration are huge. There is an expectation not only of the change of rhetoric, but also of the substance of the relations. And the expectations, I don't think that in the first months have been very easy to live up to because of the COVID crisis. However, hopefully we will see in June during both summits will underline the need for changes that we're all looking forward to. And I would say that with looking at the Biden initiatives and the Biden policies, not just in curbing down the pandemic and dealing with the economic circumstances of the pandemic or the economic fallout, but looking at the EU as a strategic partner in his value-based agenda could be a signal of another pivot to Europe, which we would like to see. And I see the United States and the European Union or Europe as natural partners, and the Transatlantic Alliance as the backbone of this liberal international order that we are all streaming to arrive.
Great, thanks, Alexandra. So is that how you see it? Big expectations in Europe and waiting to see on the delivery side? And will you unmute, please?
Sorry. Yes, I think so. And I think maybe also recapping on what Kolinda said, I think there is quite a lot of agreement that the 4 years of Trump have done some serious damage to the mutual transatlantic trust that has been there before. And I think it will be taking a while that it can be restored in a good way. I wouldn't rate it so much as an solely atmospheric change, but I would also not call it a lot of breakthroughs. I agree that definitely there has been some change of tone in the whole conversation that has happened, but be it about policy or politics. I also agree that, you know, what the Trump term effectively has done is that this led to the realization that Europe needs to be strategically autonomous, and in whatever that might conceptually mean on the EU side, which is also not quite clear. And also when we think about security and defense, facing an unreliable US, as many in Europe have called it, has been quite a challenge that hasn't been there for years. So What we have seen in the past few years on the European side is that all those defense initiatives that have been spreading in different areas, there was more thought on R&D development. This is not necessarily a bad change, but the question is now how this will be reconciled with a restart of transatlantic relations. Two main examples that come to my mind when I look at Biden's foreign policy and defense policy decisions that have been happening in the past few months, which I was following closely as a young journalist starting and covering EU foreign affairs. When taking office, Biden was emphasizing that NATO is the core of transatlantic security. And I think the opposite notion might have started to deteriorate well before Trump. There are surely some different reasons for that, but Trump did make this appear much, much more severe. He opened the cracks and kind of widened them into canyons, as some NATO officials in Brussels have put it. But the general feeling about defense spending, I think, will remain because it's a largely bipartisan issue on the US side. And I think Europeans have also realized that they need to pull their weight. And the second issue, something that I think was quite striking, was Trump's US troop withdrawal plans from Germany, which were rolled back in a significant U-turn. It was a good signal towards key EU allies because the Ramstein base, where the largest American military base outside the US is located, was mainly used as a hub in case for quick troop transfer to other parts of Europe. So, it assured a lot of allies that those troops are staying. But the flip side of this is that the fact is that the Pentagon had already been carrying out a review of forces globally, and it was long before Trump and the dispute with Germany resurfaced. So I think those two issues were quite illustrating how the changes were happening, but more over long term rather than only because Biden took office.
Great, thank you. And just mention, at least one question has come in, and I'll be feeding those in as we go along in the discussion. So great if people can continue to pose questions. So Ryan, Alexandra mentioned sort of this European notion now of an unreliable Europe. How much of what Biden needs to do is to try to convince the Europeans that the US is a reliable ally, and can he in fact do that, given that we don't know who will be elected president in 2024 and whether that person would continue the policies of the Biden administration?
I think that is the key issue in many respects, where there is a lot of goodwill. And I think you find it not just in Europe, but from essentially all other democratic governments, where they've been willing to cut Biden and his team quite a bit of slack in these first few months, because they recognize just how many domestic problems there are to deal with. But trust is no longer a given, I think, is probably the way to frame it. And people are looking to see proof in concrete actions, and we haven't seen a lot of that yet. So I would say that the words and the tone certainly matter. And if we look at issues from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to the treatment of Huawei and other strategic Chinese competitors, if we had more constructive dialogue and sort of ongoing forums over the past 4 years to discuss those issues, we'd probably be in a different place on those issues right now. That said, for all the goodwill in the world, even on an issue like climate change, the words aren't enough. I think European governments and others around the world will take Biden and John Kerry's commitment seriously when they see a larger funding package go through Congress, or when they see a 2030 target legislated. And that's going to be very, very difficult for the US to deliver on. And then you look at the more trade-related areas, and there's probably a gap between the rhetoric and the action. And I would give examples there around the fact that only today have we just started to see news on getting rid of steel tariffs, which is a pretty basic, easy thing to achieve in the grand scheme of things. And it took this long to achieve it. We have issues like the US saying it will support a global corporate minimum tax rate, and yet is still going ahead investigating European governments for putting in place digital taxes, which they did because the US withdrew from global negotiations last year at the OECD. So you've got a series of things where the words are the easy part, And I think that there's still a lot of like very difficult daily grind work to get through, and it will just take time for some of that action to be realized. But, you know, the ingredients for stronger cooperation are there. I guess patience is one of the key words as well.
So in that regard, the Biden administration has an opportunity next month with several meetings coming up to really get into a number of these issues in greater detail. The G7 meeting, US-EU, the NATO summit, and then a Biden meeting with Putin, focusing mainly probably on strategic stability and arms control. But just with respect to sort of G7, US-EU, NATO summits, sort of what are you looking at? What are you looking to see happen at these? What are you paying the most attention to? And I'll fold in a question here from Andrej Matisak, a journalist from Slovakia, who asks, what does the EU want specifically from the Biden administration? What does the EU have to offer to the Biden administration, considering its strong domestic focus? So maybe in answering this question about what you're looking for at these upcoming meetings, we can look at what Andres asked. Alexandra, why don't we start with you this time? Unmute, please.
Sorry. Maybe I start a bit more to dive into the NATO summit, actually, because I mean, it is 1 month to go, and well, it would be good for Biden to nominate the ambassador to NATO and the EU. We have heard the names, but I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity that, you know, I think everybody in Europe kind of expected that this will be happening quite quickly, that we will have them before the summit, but it doesn't seem that this will be happening quickly. In that sense, I think the June NATO summit will be interesting to watch, as the Alliance recently published its reform report that has included this recommendations to streamline NATO decision-making. And three actually particularly stand out. There is a strong notion of EU-NATO cooperation in there, but I think the most interesting one of that is actually how to curb the single country blockages. When we think, for example, about Turkey 2 years ago blocking Eastern defense plans, or making an effort to exactly block this closer NATO and EU cooperation. So I think this will be one thing to watch. However, I think a number of allies are a bit unsure on where exactly this is going. I think everybody is expecting from the US to kind of take the lead. But a number of allies have already said that you know, they're not prepared to go for far-reaching proposals. So it will be interesting to watch how far diluted those recommendations become, and how much actually there's this push for trying to, you know, restart the alliance, reshape what the next 10 years of NATO can hold, and how the US is going to lead the way, basically.
Great, thanks. And Kolinda, can you, in addition to whatever else you were going to say, respond to this point Alexandra's made about the personnel being in place? I mean, just from your perspective as a former president, former ambassador, foreign minister, assistant secretary general at NATO, I think many of us would love to see Julie Smith in this position as ambassador to NATO sooner rather than later. Karen Donfried as Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs. How important do you see it as happening? What difference does it make to have those people in place before the summit?
Oh, it's extremely important, and it's also very symbolic. I mean, we're waiting for a new ambassador to be appointed to Croatia as well. Mm-hmm. And it's a signal, you know, how fast you do it is also sort of a signal of respect and of seriousness of tackling the issues. So the sooner the ambassador to NATO gets appointed, the better. I think it's high time, because very little time remains before the summit. And I think we have some major work to do. As Ryan has rightly pointed out, the EU is already bracing for 2024. The 2020 elections show how unpredictable the system can be, not just in the US, but in any other country. So I think that push for strategic autonomy will continue, which is still a little bit controversial. Borrell said that it doesn't apply only to defense, but also to trade, to health, etc. What is good is that nobody really disputes the vital character of the transatlantic relationship and of NATO for European defense, regardless of any autonomous defense capabilities that the EU countries develop within PESCO or any other initiative. To respond to the question that we got from a member of the audience, the EU actually came up with a pretty comprehensive plan. The European Commission proactively presented its plan for transatlantic cooperation already in December of last year. That is actually entitled, I would say, probably very actively and in a way looking towards the relationship with the US as a strategic relationship, a new EU-US agenda for global change. Now, what we will see certainly at the NATO summit is we need to see adaptation of NATO. It's been one of the primary characteristics of the alliance that it has adapted to the changing circumstances. And we need that adaptation again to respond to the external, but as I also said, these internal corrosive issues that have been plaguing the alliance for the past years. So the Secretary General appointed after the London summit an independent commission to come up with a forward-looking reflection process that would strengthen the role of NATO, especially in the political field, because the last strategic concept we have dates to 2011 from Lisbon, with the 3 pillars of NATO being collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. And now we want to reinforce the values that we have seen eroded in the past years, and that is cooperation, solidarity, and cohesion, including to cement the centrality of the transatlantic alliance. We want to see more political consultations and coordination within the alliance, and strengthen NATO's political roles and instruments to address the current and the future threats and challenges. And now we will come then to the discussions in all of these events that you have mentioned, including the meetings with the EU, is the China question. The fact that the EU last year, again, signed the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which sort of signals decoupling of geostrategic interests with trade interests. The positive aspect for me being the fact that in this way, actually, the EU is trying to put some kind of control on at least the issues of protecting intellectual property, etc. But also the fact that working together with the US in protecting from cyber attacks and from disruptive technologies in the era where we're talking about 5G technologies, where China is being very assertive in the whole of Europe, not just Central Europe, where the EU has developed an independent 5G toolkit. We'll see how close the EU and the US will come, because I'm sure that the Biden administration will be looking for strong support from the EU and from NATO overall in its China policy, which at the moment is a little bit more assertive or aggressive than on the European side. So we'll see how that cooperation moves, whether it will move more towards a competition or even confrontation. And of course, there will be high expectations of what happened with President Putin. It's very close to home, not just in the Baltics or in Ukraine, but you see also Russia's influence in my own neighborhood in the so-called Western Balkans. We all want peace in Europe. We don't want any semblance of anything like a major regional war developing. So I think that looking at the events that are ahead of us, we have huge expectations, and that's why I need people to prepare the meetings really well so that we have workable conclusions that will be carried out in the months right after these crucial meetings.
And Ryan, as you answer these questions about sort of what you're looking for at these meetings coming up, I wanted to add one more thing in, which is a question whether you think journalists will be particularly interested in what a change of tone means for how Europeans pursue the defense spending issue. I mean, the Trump tone was hectoring. He would argue he got Europeans to do more because he was bludgeoning them with the 2%. Is there any thought that if Biden sort of steps back on the rhetoric and takes a different tone, that Europeans will feel less pressure to go toward the 2%?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so. I think the Europeans know they haven't been living up to what the goal has been, and Germany is the really big sticking point. Most countries are getting on the right track. It's just Germany that's stalling, basically. So I think that it's going to be more of a difficult issue for Biden around Nord Stream, where they're just coming very late to the game, where I wouldn't disagree with the administration's position, but I just don't understand how they're going to achieve it 2 minutes to midnight. But I'm sure that will be a source of tension. I would say that I will be very disappointed and intolerant if the administration turned up with the "we're back" message again. I think they have to give the rest of the world a little bit more credit. Like we can watch TV, we got the idea, they're back, but what does it mean? Like that's what really needs to happen at this next set of meetings. And the good news is that this administration is much more predictable. So you can, in fact, plan for communiques and not expect that they will get thrown out at the last minute, which is what was happening under Trump. So that's a good thing. That's positive. But at the same time, we've seen both sides of the Atlantic undercutting each other. It might have been autonomous for the EU to sign the investment agreement with China, which is now falling apart. But it was rude to do that in the weeks before the new administration came in. And by the same token, it was extremely rude of the administration to just undercut decades of IP alignment on the vaccine question and supporting the vaccine waiver without talking to Europe. So I think both sides have got to cut that out. There's got to be a lot more good faith discussions in advance of these summits. And then there will still be a lot of hard work after the summits with whatever's agreed.
Kolinda mentioned China, and I want to turn there. I'm going to start with you, Ryan, and then go to the others. And I also will bring in, there's a question from Kristen Taylor, a current AU student, about China. So I'll bring that one in. But we've seen an administration that really seems to have decided we are going to focus on this challenge from China. We are going to focus from the Indo-Pacific, and we're not going to be distracted from it. Previous administrations got distracted by other things. We're going to stay focused on it. And I think you see concerns, for example, that the administration is not as engaged as it might be with the Israeli-Palestinian issue because it doesn't want to be drawn back in there. I think you can make an argument that the position on Russia is, let's try to de-escalate with Russia because we want to keep the focus on China. We don't want to have to deal with Russia. So if that's the case, that the real focus is on China, how do you see that playing in with the US-Europe relationship? Is that going to be the thing that the Biden administration most wants from Europe? And how is Europe going to respond to that? Kristen Taylor asks, under a Biden administration, will the EU continue to keep its options open between the US and China? And how does Europe reconcile the need to engage with China and its commitment to human rights? So, especially with respect to the Uyghur issue. So how do we best think about these issues related to China?
Yeah, well, they're definitely very complex. So I would say that, yes, China is the Biden administration's top priority, but it won't succeed in beating or containing that challenge if it doesn't mobilize its allies fully. And I do think that people in the administration, the senior officials, do understand that. And so one of the things I should have mentioned in my previous answer is I'm on the lookout for some form of development of an economic version of NATO's Article 5 collective defense clause, because that's really the only thing that is going to keep Chinese economic bullying in check. And if you haven't picked up from my accent, I'm from Australia, so I know what economic bullying from China is like. And the only reason it hasn't happened to the same degree to the US and the EU is that they're larger than Australia. But that doesn't mean that China won't develop the confidence or the resources to pick those fights in the future. And so it's really the collective action that is very important there. I think you're completely right that the administration has been fairly flat-footed on the situation in Israel and Palestine in the last week, because they're determined not to get dragged into this situation. But, and this is the way of a lot of things in the Middle East, it's not as simple as just deciding you don't want to care about those issues. Because if you have a foreign policy that is designed or centered around a human rights approach, but then you ignore both sides abusing a series of human rights and humanitarian law with what's going on right now in Gaza, then you're immediately undercutting your ability to call out what is going on against the Uyghur population in China. And the US has described it as a genocide, but they've now created a situation where China can say Gaza anytime they say Xinjiang in the Security Council, for example. So it's going to be very difficult to balance all of those interests. And that's why the US and the EU have to stick together, because it's the only way any of this will get addressed effectively.
And Kolinda, I mean, you mentioned China before. I'd like to give you a chance to expand, especially in thinking about, for example, sort of as China uses different formats within Europe to try to keep the Europeans from coming together. And I'm particularly interested in your views on the 17+1 format, China and mainly Central and Eastern European countries, but also Greece, sort of how China uses different relationships and different formats to try to, enable its ability to keep engaging and investing and not let a European position coalesced against it.
Yes, well, certainly I would see that the Biden administration will seek to coordinate policies with the European Union to confront China. Now we'll see whether that happens. And Ryan has mentioned, the human policy record, etc. And there I see a bit of a failure, or the fact that the European common foreign and security policy has not really lived up to expectations, or has lived fully in order for the whole of the EU to be on the same page with relationship to China. I mean, even during the Trump administration, you could see different coalitions within the European Union with respect to the position to the EU, to the US. So the rift was not just along the transatlantic, but within the European Union itself. And I see that we will continue to see this. We've mentioned Nord Stream 2. There are at least 16 countries in the EU, including Croatia, who are heavily opposing the Nord Stream 2 project. Now with China, what the US needs to do to change with respect to the past 4 years is to develop a more collaborative, cooperative, and I would say a more respectful position towards allies. Because what we have seen is China being very assertive, not just with programs such as 17+1 or One Belt, One Road, or other initiatives that are aimed at investing into Central Europe, in particular into infrastructure. And we've seen already in some parts, Montenegro is the case in point, where they have not been able to finish the expressway that they're building with the Chinese money, and they're now asking for a bailout from the European Union. What I often pointed out to the Trump administration, and would like to do the same with the Biden administration, is that in this case, we really have to look at geoeconomics. We have to look at investment as a strategic tool of geopolitics. Because if you lack infrastructure in Central Europe and you're not getting investment from the US or from Western Europe, you're going to seek it elsewhere, whether it be in Russia or in China. Now, together with the Polish President Duda, back in 2015, we started an initiative that is called the 3 Seas Initiative that connects the 3 seas, the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Seas, with the 3 pillars: investment into infrastructure, into energy infrastructure, into transportation infrastructure, and into digitalization infrastructure. Now, of course, we're not looking at this initiative as aimed against anyone. This is an initiative for building the resilience of that crucial part of the European Union when looking towards the East and the Southeast. And strengthening infrastructure would improve cohesion without Europe, would lead to the convergence of our economies. And unless we have a true convergence in the European Union and we erase these differences between the East and the West, we will continue still not to be Europe one whole and at peace, which is what we want. So I hope that the Biden administration will be looking at these regional initiatives, such as the 3 Seas Initiative, as a way to invest, whether through the private sector or banks, in order to help us build that infrastructure so that it contributes to the resilience of the societies and the resilience of the countries. Another aspect is when you look at the position that the United States takes towards allies. I've often said it and I'll say it again. The last time that the Prime Minister of Croatia was in the Oval Office was back in 2006. So we're not asking for a state visit. We're asking for half an hour with the President of the United States so that we can discuss issues of mutual importance, which are, of course, very important for the United States as well. And I think time has come. President Biden will have an opportunity to meet with all of these leaders in Brussels and in different venues, but really for the US to change that relationship, in particular with allies, so that, as I said, it becomes a lot more collaborative.
Great, thank you. And Alexandra, any thoughts you have on where do you think China is going to fit into these meetings, and also just the way that that Europe's looking at the United States, what it thinks the United States is going to be asking Europe to do?
Yes, I think, in general, for a common EU-US policy on China, I think the Europeans must also know how to deal with Beijing first, so agree on a common position. But then it becomes more tricky when you think about, are we thinking about the EU as a whole? Are we thinking about Eastern Europeans? Or are we thinking about Paris and Berlin not being able to agree on a common position? Because I think, and I'm looking a bit more towards Germany as well, because the transatlantic cooperation on China will, I think, largely be shaped by the change in German leadership after the departure of Merkel, following the elections in September. So in some ways, when we look at the China investment agreement, it was Paris and Berlin pushing for it to be signed in principle. So both countries would have heavily benefited from it economically. But I think in general, what we have in European capitals is that there is this readiness to sit down on the table with Biden to discuss China, because Beijing's image has been so severely damaged with the human rights abuses and the crackdown in Hong Kong and so on. So I think there has been quite a change over the past 2 years in thinking in Brussels as well, especially on the substance when China was labeled as an economic competitor and systemic rival. So I think there's this recognition on both sides of the Atlantic that there needs to be a common way of influencing China, but there still needs to be concrete actions. And I think one of them could be, somebody mentioned 5G in the chat as well, maybe addressing the technological challenges in a bit broader ecosystem, not only focusing on 5G, but also on comprehensive assessment of China's technological and innovative capabilities and competitiveness in especially third countries.
Great. I want to go Kolinda, this is, I think, mainly for you, but happy to hear if Alexandra or Ryan have a thought on this one. We got a question from an AU student, Andrew Tarley. What role can the US play in conflict resolution in the Western Balkans? And how can the US help prevent the region from becoming an object of great power competition? I think it's definitely part of great power competition. So I don't know if prevent is the word anymore, but your thought on the US role in the Western Balkans.
Oh, yeah, it's a great question, actually, because as I said, people often think about Eastern Europe or Ukraine, etc. But the Western Balkans or the wider Southeast Europe has become an area where we see competition. But just, we had a question from the audience earlier about options, whether the EU will keep options open between the US and China. That will never happen. The US will always be the option. The US will always be the ally. It's just a matter of how we proceed on building our relations and agreeing on some of these contentious issues. But what I would like to see is a re-engagement of the United States in the Western Balkans. Throughout the past years, due to different reasons, the big fifth enlargement wave, etc., we've seen disillusionment, and we see that people were getting tired of enlargement. However, until we have seen all the countries in the southeast of Europe as members of the European Union and of NATO, for those who want that, we know that Serbia, for instance, is not keen on NATO membership, but you never know in the future. So until we have seen these countries as member states of the European Union, the area will always be vulnerable. I think this is the basic precondition for lasting peace, stability, and security in the Western Balkans. What has been happening? In the meantime, NATO has done more in terms of Montenegro and Northern Macedonia having become member states of NATO. But we haven't seen much respect to EU enlargement. A lot of these countries are at different stages of development, at different stages of negotiations with the European Union, and we haven't seen things move forward. Now, of course, we all support fulfillment of the criteria for membership, from Copenhagen democratic institutions to market economies to the specific criteria from the stabilization and association process in terms of resolving open issues in the neighborhood. That includes the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. However, during these times that the integration process has slowed down, it has created a dangerous vacuum that is being filled by third forces who are not necessarily benevolent. So we see influence from Russia to Turkey. We see that Erdogan is very much interested in what goes on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've seen influences also from Iran, from the countries in the Gulf. And as I said, they're not necessarily benevolent, they're not necessarily bad. But what I would like to see is really for these countries to be firmly on the road towards creating that ideal of Europe free and at peace. Because right now we are losing hearts and minds of people. People are getting discouraged. People are getting persuaded. Why are you pushing for something to become a member of club where they don't want you in the first place? No matter what you do, you're not good enough, and then alternatives are being presented. And this isn't good. So I hope that even though obviously the US is not a member state of the EU, I do believe that the US is a European power as well, so that the Biden administration will be pushing not only for the resolution of the remaining open issues in the neighborhood, but also for an improved and accelerating path of these countries on the way to Euro-Atlantic integration.
Great, thanks. There are a couple questions that are related that I want to pose to Alexandra and to Ryan. We talked about strategic autonomy before, but the question is, do you see Europe continuing down the path of European strategic autonomy, or will we see that momentum slow down? I assume the premise of that question is that if the Biden administration now is more engaged, with Europe, that maybe that'll take some of the pressure off this idea of strategic autonomy. But there is a question from Santiago de la Precia. Does Europe need to get used to the major swing in American politics every 4 to 8 years, which I assume if you're thinking this place could go any different direction every 4 or 8 years, that presumably would lead you to deciding that in fact some kind of strategic autonomy was necessary. Alexandra, what do you think about that particular type of question?
I think in general, the concept of strategic autonomy is here to stay. I mean, it won't go away now that it's appeared. I think everything else would be bad strategic thinking. But I think what we should remember is that the EU constantly emphasizes that all the strategic autonomy pushes are in relation to NATO. They're coherent with NATO. So this is every statement, every time this is emphasized. And I think the other aspect of that is also that a lot of those defense initiatives actually now opened up to third country participation, so non-EU participation. We have seen the latest developments with the PESCO project on military mobility, something that is considered as the flagship of EU defense cooperation, where the US, Canada and Norway have been admitted to the project as well. So that's one way of trying to kind of synchronize both EU and NATO in their defense initiatives. Obviously, it's a question whether the other projects will go the same way, but the point about military mobility is to get the troops across the block if needed. So I think that's one of the starting points where this could see more cooperation in the future. For the rest, well, it remains, I think, to be seen. We have the European Defence Fund, which is R&D and technology. There is for now, I think, no, as far as I remember, no agreement on third country participation, but maybe there's some kind of other developments coming in the next few months and years. So it's kind of, ambiguous and somewhere in the vacuum that maybe there might be more aligning between Washington and the EU, when there is political will for it.
Ryan, strategic autonomy here to stay, and US maybe even actually becoming even more supportive of the idea, especially if it's going to be focused on China. It would seem that the United States has a stake in Europe developing more significant capabilities of its own. That's the only way for the US to really do China.
And the other way to think of it is that this is what the US wanted, and we don't always like what we want when we end up getting it. But I think the EU, it can take a long time to sort of either turn the ship around, whatever the metaphor is, get the rolling stock moving. And it's very hard to stop it once it does get moving. So I think for that reason, it's sticking around. COVID's also demonstrated a series of flawed assumptions that we made about our supply chains under this era of globalization. And so that as well will provide further impetus for European countries to make sure that they can organize themselves regardless of who is in the White House. But I do think that, especially if it was a two-term Democratic presidency, you might see a little bit more strategic interdependence, where there might be some collaborative projects, whether it's on the space front or on climate change, for example, where it is about developing more capability, but not sort of against China or against the US, but rather with allies. And it gets back to that point of democratic countries needing to engage in more cooperation, whether it is standard setting for AI or some other emerging technology. Like it's absolutely the case that democracies will have a different set of values that they want to bring to the table. So, part of that strategic autonomy for Europe is making sure it's not at odds with the US, because you don't want to be fighting everybody at once. Otherwise, you're not going to be autonomous. You're just going to be defensive and out of pocket a lot of the time.
So in September, we are coming to the end of an era in Europe with the elections in Germany. And, Chancellor Merkel has been such a fixture for so long as the Chancellor of Germany, and also a major figure in Europe. And so we have a question here from Kathleen Teig. How might the elections in Germany and the post-Merkel era affect US-German relations and transatlantic relations in general? And I would say, and I would also posit intra-European relations as well. Kolinda, would you like to take any piece of that?
Yes, of course. Speaking about strategic autonomy, it's definitely here to stay. I don't think that we will ever see development of an autonomous EU defense force. But strategic autonomy, for now, we talk about defense industry and defense cooperation. However, it does extend to other areas. And we have seen the China move, the investment treaty signing, as I would say an element of an attempt at that strategic autonomy. And of course, the COVID-19 situation, the vaccine nationalism that has been developing, the shortages of vaccine, that will also prompt Europe to become a bit more dependent on itself. Now, with respect to the concept of the strategic autonomy, we see a bit of a difference now between Germany and France. Germany, I would say, has argued for, in spite of Nord Stream 2, for a more closer relationship with the US, whereas with President Macron, I would say that, from his recent statements and from his insistence on the conference on the future of Europe that has just started and that we'll see end in June next year before France takes over the presidency, etc. I think that President Macron would like for Europe really to cease to be the junior partner to the US and to be on an equal footing. With the new leadership, I don't think that we'll see a change of the situation overnight. I think that the new administration in Germany will be careful how to proceed, and they will continue to look at the transatlantic relationship as the backbone of European security as well. Now, with the development of more European capabilities, I would look at those capabilities as something that is aimed at internal security, but hopefully external as well. As we see, President Biden announcements to pull out of Afghanistan, as we see the situation in the Middle East escalating, I hope that the EU will take a more assertive role in the domain of the common security, foreign and security policy, and that will also mark the future of Europe. For that, we will need to see more agreement within the European Union as well. But overall, I am optimistic. Again, I think that the EU will still have the year 2024 in mind when developing policies and when looking at its relationship with the Biden administration. But certainly I can testify not only to the will of the European leaders, but also of citizens across Europe to overcome the current rifts that we have across the Atlantic and to work a lot more closely in resolving the issues that certainly affect both sides of the Atlantic in terms of security, but also health and well-being. So the future I would see as more transferring from that burden sharing insistence and insisting really on the 2% now with the post-COVID situation. We'll see how the countries will be doing, to more, so from burden sharing to more responsibility sharing. And I think that the new German administration will be open to concepts such as that.
Ryan, do you see similar to Kolinda, sort of more continuity rather than change as we move to a post-Merkel era?
Yes, overall, but that doesn't mean there won't be enough grist for journalists to chew over for months on end. Macron becomes the top dog when Merkel leaves, and that won't necessarily be a permanent shift, but there isn't anybody that can fill Angela Merkel's shoes. And you might see some really unusual dynamics as well, where if it is Annalena Baerbock, the German Green candidate, she's fiercely opposed to Nord Stream as well. And so the idea of German Greens and Republicans in Congress teaming up with each other, that will be a fascinating spectacle if we see that unfold. And probably it elevates Britain back into transatlantic discussions more than they otherwise would be, because like the US needs an anchor, and even though Britain has been a difficult partner in recent years because of Brexit, it's more of a steady ship than whoever steps into the German leadership. They're just going to really struggle to fill the space that Angela Merkel has occupied.
Alexandra, it's an exciting time for you as a journalist in Europe that you get to have this transition in Germany that it's been a long time coming to have a change in leadership.
Definitely. I mean, also because I grew up in Germany, so I do follow German politics quite closely, and that's why I think it was quite significant. It was a few days ago, I think a week ago, that Baerbock had her first speech, a transatlantic speech actually, and I think it was very significant that she said that if she's elected, that her country should be more active on foreign policy, act more responsibly. That's kind of tones that have been developing over the years in the Green Party, but that also signal a bit more of a shift from the pacifist stance from the past and more towards the center. So I think, especially what Ryan also mentioned, the going geopolitical. He mentioned Nord Stream 2, but she was also pretty strong on China and human rights abuses and all this kind of thing. So I think it will be very interesting to watch if the Greens really do well in polls, and then maybe might have some kind of government participation where this is going. Yeah.
We have a question from Stefan Barbier-Rite, who is a AU alum. Do the panelists see any prospects for a transatlantic trade agreement and meaningful harmonization on environmental standards? Ryan, you want to kick us off there?
No, I wish it were otherwise, because I do think it's a really important step forward for the global economy. It's in a way, it's crazy that these two sides can't come to an agreement, but the business models for agriculture are very different. The ability to integrate the services markets, it's more possible now with digital, but that's still limited as well. And the Biden administration is just not interested in doing any deals that would create problems for it in former Rust Belt states or with middle-class suburban constituencies. And that is almost any trade deal that you can think of. So it's either going to be highly sectoral specific, or it's going to be, a few flashy little headlines. It's not going to be these big comprehensive TTIP style agreements, unfortunately. And that is probably true for 10 years, not just the next couple of years.
So this is a really important point. I'm eager to hear from Kolinda and Alexandra on this. I mean, as President Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, it does suggest a set of policies that are in conflict with his emphasis on, closer alliances, because, foreign policy for the middle class does tend to suggest sort of more protectionist approach, which may negatively affect the alliances. And presumably every country in NATO and the European Union is eager to have a foreign policy for its middle class. So how do these get reconciled? Alexandra, start with you and then to Kolinda.
I think I'm not quite sure how to rate this. Maybe I have a bit too less insight in the US side, but I think in general the US needs to fix its own home before going to the world stage again, because to some extent there's quite some evident domestic political and judicial constraints. I think that will limit the Biden's policy horizon. So it remains to be seen in which direction he actually can go. But I think, from the European perspective, the US needs to fix its own house first. And whatever Biden's personal preferences may be, he's somewhat constrained by his party and the general public opinion on whether Americans should prioritize domestic policy over foreign policy.
Kolinda, don't all presidents worry about their middle class and making sure they have a policy?
Well,
that
we
works for the middle
worry
class?
about everyone. We worry about every single citizen. And yes, I was personally very disappointed when the TTIP talks were put on the back burner. I know there was a lot of criticism within the European Union as well, but I think that it would have been a good way to regulate the trade between the two sides of the Atlantic. Now, it's obvious that the two most important preoccupations for President Biden will be now the pandemic that he's putting under control, so to end the pandemic. And the second one will be the recovery program, which means not just keeping, but creating new jobs. And that means protecting the middle, but also other classes, the lower classes as well. So that will be in conflict to his foreign policy aspirations, and it remains to be seen how that will affect the transatlantic trade. It would be good if we could do away at least with those tariffs that have been so again, controversial or that have been so corrosive of the relationship across the Atlantic, and that have really hurt the relationship, and try to find some kind of middle way. Otherwise, that will push the EU only further towards China and to cooperating with others, because the EU also wants to protect its middle classes and all citizens, and create better investment opportunities and opportunities for trade and development for the EU, not just to be a secondary player on the global scene in terms of trade and investment, but really to be one of the most important trade partners. So we'll see how that relationship will continue to develop in that quadrangle between the United States, the EU, Russia, and China, the quadrangle of power that we see has developed in the recent months and years, and I think will continue to develop regardless of the other rising powers in the world.
So, and while you have the floor, Kolinda, there's a question for you from Jerry Sheridan, our amazing director of the AU Abroad program in Brussels. And for any students who are watching, if you have the opportunity to spend a semester in Brussels with Jerry and his program, and hopefully you might even get to do an internship with Alexandra while you're there. It's really a wonderful program. And he asks, the NATO group of experts called for the creation of a NATO university to foster a sense of Atlantic community and commonality among youth. How likely is it that this idea might materialize?
Oh, I would absolutely support that idea. You know, NATO has a defense college in Rome, but currently it's just limited to mostly military personnel and some civilian personnel who deal with NATO or security issues in NATO countries and partner countries. But to see a university where we would promote the transatlantic partnership would be wonderful, because NATO is not just a military alliance, it's a political alliance, and most importantly, it's an alliance of values. And one of the most important being solidarity among us all, and I would say mutual respect, and upholding the same values of democracy, freedom, peace and security of all, and the universality of human rights that cannot be labeled by any geographical, cultural, religious, or any other distinction.
Great. Well, we have just under 15 minutes left, and I wanted to get to a couple countries that haven't been mentioned yet because we have questions about them. So one question is, how do panelists see the future prospects for Turkey? This question poses that and the likelihood that it will remain connected to the West. I suppose we can broaden that out, and Turkey's relationship with NATO, and sort of what a more independent Turkish foreign policy that we've seen in recent years means for its connections with Europe, particularly with NATO, but maybe also its relationship with the EU, especially if we end up with another round of refugees, in this case from Afghanistan, after Western troops leave Afghanistan. Ryan, your thoughts on Turkey and where it fits in here?
Yeah, Turkey's been extremely independent in recent years, and I think that's extremely difficult for the West, but it's probably quite rational if you are Turkey, or at least if you're Erdogan. And so that I think that is going to stay that way purely because the EU is not going to move towards bringing Turkey in as a member. And to circle back to that earlier discussion, I think, while we have to be realistic that EU members are not likely to accept new member countries in the next few years, it's extremely short-sighted to not create a more formal waiting room, let's say, and to offer more carrots. Every action has a cost. And even if you think that as a European politician that your local constituency won't accept the EU further expanding and that there's just no way for that to happen, there's still a cost to that choice. When we're seeing that with Turkey now, we see Turkey hold the EU to ransom over migration, and they can do it because they have the leverage, because they do host so many of those huge communities. And the EU just really doesn't have any leverage there. You see that with Erdogan going on with the construction of the new canal that he wants to create, where that is only someone that has all the leverage in those relationships could go ahead with an idea like that. And so I don't know what the US has planned in respect for Turkey, but I don't think the US has a lot of leverage either. I think Turkey is determined to reassert itself in its neighborhood, and it just has a lot of leverage, so it's going to keep doing it.
Do you see it the same way, Alexandra?
Yes, I do agree. Also because I think in all those reports, Borrell wrote the Turkey report, the parliament was calling in resolutions for, introducing democratic conditionality to all aspects of the relationship between Turkey and the EU. But on the other side, and I think this is actually a wider question, how Biden might potentially re-engage with Europe's slightly autocratic leaders in general, because I'm not thinking only about Turkey, but also about Hungary, Poland, Slovenia. So I think the question is a bit if the Biden administration may be tempted to, return to the Obama policy of disdain and isolation, or actually engage in rule of law dialogue. So in the case of Turkey, that would be interesting to see because it is a NATO member.
And Kolinda, in that regard, the NATO 2030 group talked about the idea of creating a center for democratic resilience to try to figure out a way to sort of get at some of these issues within NATO about countries that are struggling with their democratic foundations, and certainly, from an American perspective, as a country that had an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, there's a lot for the United States to, this isn't just about the US trying to figure out how to deal with Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. It's also the US strengthening its own democracy. How do you see that? What do you think about that idea about a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO?
I think it's a great idea. I don't know whether all countries would sign up for the idea, though. We were all stunned, of course, by the events of January 6th in the US. And I often got questions, does it remind you of the situation in the former Yugoslavia when it was falling apart? I said, no, it's completely different, because the former Yugoslavia was an autocratic state that suppressed the rights of people. And here you are in a democratic union that is not perfect, that you acknowledge that is not perfect, and you're working towards a more perfect union, which President Biden underlined so many times in his inauguration speech. Now, looking at Turkey, Turkey has been distancing itself from NATO throughout the past years, and I've seen that in practice. Personally, I always maintained a good relationship with President Erdogan, because his influence in the region is also crucial for security and stability of Croatia. We were talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina and the future of that country. which still has this high representative of the international community of the Peace Implementation Council, who are taking the basic decisions for Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we need to see the country fully politically emancipated. And obviously, President Erdogan cannot be bypassed, or Turkey, in those conversations. Because of traditional relations. And I must say that in the early 90s, actually, Turkey played a very constructive role during the different wars in our neighborhood, trying to broker peace, especially between Croats and Muslims, etc. And when I talk about President Erdogan, you know, you've mentioned migration waves. 2015 and 2016 were very difficult for us. We've seen more than 700,000 cross through Croatia. And depending on what happens in Afghanistan, as you rightly said, we can expect millions of refugees potentially who will come our way. And I always try to explain to President Erdogan, look, any disagreement you have with the European Union, you know, please think of the immediate consequences of those refugee waves that would affect, most of all, Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans. And Croatia would be on the first line, because the truth of the matter is that European countries do not want more migrants. The asylum policy stands. I think that we've seen that we haven't been exactly fair towards refugees in terms that we've let those who were able either physically or financially to cross into Europe, and then we close the gates, and we're forgetting about those who have been left behind, not only in Syria, but in other places as well. So managing the situation in Afghanistan will not be easy, but working with Erdogan will certainly be very important. And I believe that we have to keep Turkey on the European path. It will not be easy with respect to fulfilling the democratic and other criteria, but we have to keep insisting. And the Center on Democratic Resilience could help in that respect, but again, only if the countries really sign up for it, honestly. And I think that there will be a number of countries who will embrace that gladly, because they do need internal and external support in increasing the resilience of their societies. But unfortunately, I think that we will see some of the countries who need it most stay out of the initiative.
So one country, I mean, got a brief mention earlier, and that was the UK. And we did have a question coming in post-Brexit. Are there more opportunities for closer US-UK ties under a Biden administration? Ryan, what's your thought on that? And Alexandra and Kolinda, what's your view on sort of how the UK figures into these US-Europe conversations? Go, yeah. Ryan, Alexandra, and then Kolinda.
The biggest opportunity in the next few months will be climate, where it's going to be an uphill battle to get a new global agreement or a new set of coordinated targets out of all of the leading economies. They're certainly getting there when it comes to 2050, but it's just the medium term where I think there's a bunch of issues, and the UK and the US really need each other there. So I think that is certainly a bright spot. I don't think that the defense relationship was ever in doubt. It was just parked to the side a little bit because of the EU problems. But where the UK is going to get nothing and has got nothing is around the possible trade deal. Their what's called fast track promotion authority is going to expire. And that's not something that Downing Street wanted to hear, and they were very annoyed when I wrote that story over the Christmas break, but it's turned out to be true. So I think it's, there's patchiness there, but at the end of the day, it's going to remain a close relationship. I don't think that the US can afford to abandon either the UK or the EU, and certainly not because the two of them are fighting. So I think, it's not ideal, but, it's basically okay, is what I think is the state of that special relationship.
Alexandra?
Yes, I think I agree. And also maybe an interesting question to watch will be whether, the UK will find the role of this hub for EU-US facilitation of dialogue and on some issues. And personally, I think I'm looking forward to whether the UK will actually join some of the EU defense projects and how this relationship might develop in the next few months and years. everybody was waiting for them to already apply, but again, others were quicker. Turkey was the latest one to try to join military mobility, but from the UK, we haven't seen much. So I think there's a lot of thinking to do on where they want to go and whether they want to maybe rethink the association with the EU.
Great. And Kolinda, you get the last word.
Well, thank you. Yes, we may have seen Brexit and the UK may have left the European Union, but the UK will remain a group of islands firmly anchored alongside the shores of Europe. So I agree with Alexandra that we'll see this balancing act between the EU and the US, where certainly cooperation will continue in the defense sector. The UK will remain a member state of NATO, but perhaps we can see some facilitation on part of the UK when it comes to these trade and other issues in order to find a common language between the two sides of the Atlantic.
Great. Well, this has been an amazing panel. I'm so grateful to all three of you. Very grateful as well to those who joined the conversation, and the questions that were asked from the audience were absolutely terrific. I thank Garrett Martin for his tremendous leadership at American University on transatlantic issues. And Kate, thank you for setting this all up. And I hope folks can join the next event in this workshop series, which will take place this coming Wednesday, May 19th. So thanks everyone for joining.